Hello. In the Tang Dynasty, there were many subjects or themes that went into poems. This impressive variety is also part of the reason why we said poetry in Tang reached a peak. We've seen many themes, such as saying goodbye, missing homes, we see 李白竟也思, feeling sad, 张继枫桥夜泊, feeling happy, 李白早发白帝城, about wars, 王之涣凉州词, scenery, 杜甫绝句, historical events, 刘禹锡石头城, etc., etc. We've learned all these poems. There is another important subject we haven't seen yet. We know that in the ancient days, the emperors were sitting at the very top of the social pyramid with absolute power and uncountable wealth. They often had a mass number of servants, male and female, looking after him in every aspect of personal life. These servants basically had to give up their whole life in the service of the emperors. In particular, most of the women were in a more dire situation. They normally had to leave home at a very young age and stayed in the emperor's court until their death. The trade-off is, if you are lucky enough to get noticed by the emperor and can get close to him, you will get fame, wealth, and power as well. However, of hundreds and thousands of them, how many can get there? So for the vast majority, ever since they went to the emperor's court, they would just stay there, doing nothing, not allowed to go anywhere but their small designated space, and being bored throughout their lives with the only extremely slim hope that one day they could get to the emperor, which, of course, most of the time never came true. This is unimaginable to us modern people. Such youth, such lives are effectively wasted in every true sense. So in the Tang Dynasty, there were many poems written about the misery of these women, with a lot of compassion that can be felt. Today we are going to learn one such poem. Before I explain anything else, let's read this poem first. 长信秋词，凤肘平明金殿开，暂将团扇共徘徊。欲言不及寒鸦色，犹待朝阳日影来。This poem was written by Wang Changling, the poet who was widely regarded as one of the best in writing poems in the 七言绝句 format, if not the very best. He was really masterful at creating very fascinating and charming scenes through a clever structure and some amazing metaphor, and hiding his messages in a thought-provoking way. The reader had to think with some effort to get his points, but those points were so beautifully presented. We've previously learned his 出塞, which described a magnificent and a courageous scene at the frontiers of the Tang Empire. And I'm sure you can appreciate this style is very different from Li Bai, who is another great in the 七言绝句 format. Li Bai's style, in contrast, is very naturally flowing, seemingly without any elaborate thinking, as if he just grabbed words from his mouth. His 飞流直下3000尺, 疑是银河落九天, and 两岸猿声啼不住, 轻舟已过万重山, etc., etc. Let's look at this poem. 长信 is a name of an old palace in the Han Dynasty, some 800-900 years before this poem was written. In the Tang Dynasty, there was a habit or a set rule that whenever you want to refer to the current dynasty or the current emperor, you can't just openly say so. Instead, you would borrow the names, places, and events from the Han Dynasty. And everyone should know that even though it's the reference to the Han Dynasty on paper, it's really about the Tang Dynasty. This Changxing Palace used to be the residence of a talented woman who was dearly loved by the emperor at the time, but then got abandoned. So she had to stay in this Changxing Palace miserable and bitter till her death. So whenever people later made reference to 长信, it's almost always about the subject of how miserable and resentful abandoned women in the emperor's court were. We have to remember that even though the whole poem might be about events and places of the Han dynasty, what's actually intended is about this subject in general, and particularly for women in the current dynasty. 秋 is autumn, and 词 is words, here just meaning a poem, as in other popular titles such as 凉州词. We said before that these poems were frequently sung by professional singers to a tune. Let's see what scene the poet had portrayed for us. 凤 means to hold. 肘 is a broom. So 凤肘 means to hold a broom. Who is holding a broom? Here the subject was left out. It's a protagonist of the poem, the woman who lived in this Changxing palace. 平明 means early in the morning. 金 is golden. 殿 is palace. 开 is to open. What is this line saying? It's early in the morning, the golden palace just opened its doors, and someone comes out, a broom in her hand. Try to see this scene in your brain. It's rather grand and majestic scene, isn't it? Why is she holding a broom? Well, she probably needs to sweep the courtyard in front of the palace. It's autumn, isn't it? It's in the title, 长信秋词. Qiu is autumn. So leaves must have fallen, and this woman would want to sweep away the leaves. But we know in the old days, these women, they themselves had quite a lot of servants, so it wouldn't be their responsibility to personally do these chores themselves. But she decided to do it anyway. Why? Of course, it's because she must feel so bored, day after day, being alone by herself, doing nothing. So doing some labor work in the morning might be a rather attractive activity. But do we think she would really engage in this tiresome job which her servants should really do? No. We could imagine that she would feel bored all the same, or tired after a few sweeps. So what would she do? 暂 means temporarily. 将 means to take, to hold. 团扇 is a type of round fan that people use in the summer like this. 共 means together, and 徘徊 means to walk around up and down as if either in hesitation or just physically nowhere else to go other than walking in circles. So while the woman stops sweeping and puts down the broom, she temporarily takes out a round fan and walk, or perhaps in dancing steps with it. Again, we can see this has to be the result of complete boredom. What else can she do? Constrained in a palace, even though the palace is grand and bright, she could only resort to these meaningless and petty things to kill time. Now there is another purposeful reference to a historical event. This 团扇. The very woman in the Han dynasty that got abandoned that we mentioned earlier, she used to write a poem about this 团扇. Basically, she was saying, in the summer, this round fan was so much in people's favor, but when autumn comes, when the weather gets colder, people no longer need it, so they just abandon it. The woman was using the 团扇 as a metaphor to say she was exactly like that fan, and when no longer loved, had the fate of being abandoned. So in this poem, Wang Changling made such a reference to emphasize from another dimension the reality of this woman now being totally neglected. So the first lines describe the background, as many such full-line poems do, a lonely, miserable woman having nothing meaningful to entertain herself. This boredom is in stark contrast to the magnificent palace building that we could almost visualize that stood tall behind her. What else could our poet write to capture her misery, her helplessness, and her very unfortunate fate? Wang Changling again used a metaphor or allegory involving another comparison, very clever and very powerful. Comparison is always a great and effective way to highlight what is intended for. Here, yu is jade, the precious stone that the Chinese people are particularly fond of. Yan here means the looking of a girl. So yu yan, jade looking, means a girl is so beautiful that her looking is as pretty and precious as a piece of jade. Now it's obvious, referring to this woman, that her looking was extremely beautiful. Ji is matching, as good as. Bu is not. So bu ji is not as good as. Han is cold, and ya is wu ya, the crow, a bird traditionally not associated with being pretty. The crow is said to be so because of the cold weather, because of the cold weather, as now it's autumn. A reference to a cold crow usually brings unpleasant mood, be it cold or lonely or miserable, etc. Se is color, and here also means looking, the same as this yan. So what is this line talking about? The jade-looking, the yu yan, such beautiful-looking girl, is actually no match, is not as good as even the looking of a cold crow. What a surprise. Why is that? The answer is in the last line. You is still. Dai is to bring. Who brings? What is the subject? It's actually referring to the cold crow, the Han Ya, following the previous line. Now, Zhaoyang is the name of another palace in the Han Dynasty, the residence of the emperor and the woman that she was then closely living with. We can notice this name, Zhaoyang, literally means the bright sun. And we know the sun is typically associated with the emperor about their power and generosity. So the sun, or even the name of this palace, containing the word sun, because of the presence of the emperor, took on the symbolic meaning of the ultimate kindness, care, and love from the most powerful man, which this woman in the Changxing Palace was surely seeking and longing for. Ri is the sun, Ying is shadow, and Lai is to come. So this line is saying, even the cold crow, because it could fly freely in the sky and would be able to pass the Zhaoyang Palace, and by doing so will be able to bring some shadow of the sun with it. But we said that the sun from the Zhaoyang Palace represented the kindness and love from the emperor, so that was very, very precious. For the cold crow, even if it's not liked by people, by dipping into the sun above Zhaoyang Palace, even by a tiny bit, it was still considered lucky with huge benefit. And in contrast, even though this woman owned a beautiful looking, now that she has been abandoned, she couldn't get close to the emperor and couldn't touch even the tiniest bit of the sun from the emperor's palace. That's why the poet said, in essence, she was even not as lucky as, not even as worthy as a cold crow. This comparisons and revelation was very striking, very surprising, but so fitting, hitting the point spot on, and extremely poetic. The message, once you understand the meaning of the lines, couldn't be clearer. There is a deep sympathy expressed towards this abandoned woman. And if we think further, the poet wasn't just sympathizing with this woman in history in the Han Dynasty, nor with any specific woman in the Tang Dynasty, but rather referring to this whole category of women who had to face their long life in this almost prison-like place. And because it is hidden in a beautiful language of a poem, even though this message itself is heavy and dark in nature, we don't normally feel overwhelmed by the tragedies of these women, but tend to feel, while the situation is lamentable, it's rather thought-provoking, which could make us sympathize more with these unfortunate souls thousands of years ago. That's all for today. Thank you.